Where are we holding? Things to use. Okay. So we have learned that when one overcomes that which is unholy, this gives pleasure to God, right? That was the main idea that we've discussed the past few classes. In the context, we were dealing with the, how does the translator put it? Evil thoughts and desires that enter one's mind. Right? These are things that it is forbidden to voluntarily think about. And even though one cannot fully control whether they enter one's mind, one can control whether they continue to think about those things. And that was the context in which this discussion occurred. Having now established how meaningful it is to God when we overcome what is unholy, the Alter Rebbe Tanya is now going to move to discussing how we can do this even with regard to things which are permitted, things that there is no halachic prohibition involved. So we will start. Moreover, even in the case of things that are fully permissible. Okay. Now, let us talk about this term, fully permissible. In Judaism, we have something called a mitzvah. What is a mitzvah? A commandment. Right? This is good. We're going in the right track so far. Okay. What is a commandment? Explain to me. Pretend I've never heard the English word. Explain to me what a commandment is.
Something that you are told to do or not do.
I think you're told to do it. It doesn't make it a commandment.
A not optional action you're told to do by someone that's above you.
Okay. Right. A commandment, right? A commandment is something that you are under some kind of obligation to do because an authority figure has told you have to do it. Right? Now, it is optional in the sense, this is a very important idea, is that it is optional in the sense that you have the choice whether to comply with the obligation. Right? And therefore you can be held responsible for it. Right? So compliance is voluntary, but obligation is not voluntary. Good? Okay. To put this in very, very clear terms, if someone takes on keeping kosher, what is incorrect about that from a religious point of view?
Takes on.
I'm now taking on kosher. Like, I didn't keep kosher, and I'm going to take on the mitzvah of keeping kosher. What's wrong with that?
The mitzvah is always there.
You're already obligated to keep kosher compliance, right? You can take upon yourself the compliance with the mitzvah, right? And the obligation was there all along. This is different than, say, if you take on to, say, an extra chapter of Psalms every day. Is there an obligation to say an extra chapter of Psalms every day?
No.
So you can take that upon yourself if you want, and if you don't, right? Fine. Now, many of the mitzvahs entail what are called isurim. What are isurim? Isurim are prohibitions. This means in order to meet my obligations to God, I must not do things. Sometimes because God explicitly told me not to do it. An example of something God explicitly told me not to do. Not to break Shabbos. Okay. Well, not to specifically do malacha on Shabbos. Okay. And sometimes it's by implication, because God told me to do something, and by implication, that means I can't do something else. What would be an example of that?
Say that again.
God tells me to do something, and by implication, I can't do something else. So it creates a prohibition.
God told you to wash your hands before you say his name in the morning, and so you can't say his name
Correct.
in the morning.
Right. That would be a good example, right? We are required to wash our hands for prayer, okay? And that means that there is a prohibition of praying without washing your hands. Now, this gets very, very complicated. How strong is a prohibition? What if it conflicts with other things? How do you override it? Okay, good. Now, if something is not prohibited, it's just not prohibited, then what is it? It is permitted. What is the Hebrew word for permitted? Mutar, permitted. Good. What is odd about the phrase that the Tanya used? Let's read that phrase again from the moreover until the second comma. Moreover, even in the case of things that are fully permissible. Fully, right? That word fully does not seem to be appropriate. If there is no prohibition, then by default it is permissible. Okay, I'll give you an example. Sometimes, by the way, people's minds are warped in the sense that the status quo is off. Okay, so for example, food. As a status quo, without knowing anything else, does the Torah assume that food is permissible or food is prohibited? Permissible, right? Unless the Torah says you're not allowed to eat something, and you can eat it, right? That makes sense? Okay. On the other hand, you're familiar with the idea that there are the intermediate days in festival called Chol HaMoed? Okay. On Chol HaMoed, are you allowed to do the forbidden activities that you are forbidden from doing on festival? Yeah, that's why we call them intermediate activities, right? Okay. On Chol HaMoed, is the status quo that things are permitted, or the status quo that things are forbidden? Everything is forbidden until there's an explicit reason why it's permitted. So if you can't do it on the festival, you can't do it on Chol HaMoed unless there's a reason why it's allowed.
What's the language in
Legamre, which means completely. Completely permitted, which also is problematic.
Where are we in the Hebrew?
In the Hebrew, it would be, you see where it says velo, chafei shvat, velo od. So some things are prohibited, some things are permitted. It's a simple binary. There's not completely permitted, completely prohibited. It either is or it is not. Okay? Now, sometimes the default is that something is prohibited until the Torah comes and tells us, no, this is permitted. Let's say activities on Chol HaMoed, on the intermediate days that we normally would not be able to do on a festival on the Yom Tov, but the Torah permits it. So an example would be something that for Tzorech HaMoed, for the fest, celebrating the festival, is permitted. So if you want to drive to the grocery store to pick up some groceries, that's fine. Okay. On the intermediate days. Okay. But not everything is permitted. And then when it comes to food, unless it's one of the things that Torah prohibits you from eating, you can eat it. Okay. Good. But the concept of mutar, permitted, and asur, forbidden, are binaries. It either is or it isn't. There isn't like the notion of more or less, complete or incomplete, seems very odd from a halachic, from a standpoint of how we go about doing the mitzvahs. Make sense? Question? And yet, the Alter Rebbe, who is very terse in the Tanya, goes out of his way to add this qualified word, legamre, even if it's completely permitted. So we want to understand, what does it mean something is completely permitted? Now, I want to give you a suggestion as to what it means, and then I want to reject that suggestion as not being sufficient. It doesn't hold up to scrutiny. We know that sometimes there are differing opinions as to whether one is allowed or not allowed to do something. So, for instance, Hashem tells us that we must only eat certain foods, and therefore prohibited from eating other foods, right? Now I have a food in front of me. I want to know, is this a forbidden food or not a forbidden food, right? And Rabbi A says it's permitted. And Rabbi B says it's forbidden. And now what should I do, right? Do I follow Rabbi A or do I follow Rabbi B? Is that completely permitted or is it not completely permitted?
Completely permitted by one person and completely forbidden by another.
Right. Now, we could then say, well, I don't know what to do. And so Rabbi C says, well, given the situation, you should not eat it. But in a different situation, maybe you could rely on the other opinion. But in terms of the actual thing itself, the dispute is either it is or it isn't forbidden, right? This actually gets into, people get confused about things because of how we speak. So we say, like, for instance, Ashkenazim can't eat rice on Pesach, and Sephardim can. Okay. Does that mean that? Does that mean like there's a dispute whether rice is really is fully permitted or not fully permitted? Yeah, that means that one says you can eat rice and one says you can't eat rice. Mm-hmm. And the question is, which rabbi's opinion are you beholden to? Why they dispute, that's not the purpose of this class, right? But the rabbi that says it's prohibited says it's, and the rabbi that says it's permitted says it's. And if I don't know which rabbi I'm supposed to follow, that's a totally separate question of what it has to do with rice. that has to do, I just don't know which rabbi I'm supposed to follow. Maybe there are rules about that. But in terms of the rice itself, on Pesach, it either is or isn't permitted, right? There isn't more or less in this regard. Something isn't more or less kosher. Either is kosher or isn't kosher. Maybe there's a dispute about whether it's kosher, and I'm going to adopt the stringent lenient view, whatever. This whole phrase of completely doesn't really make sense. So, and again, applying the fact that we have different, say, standards of halacha that we follow doesn't really address this, because with the different standards of halacha are just different opinions as to where to draw the line. But everyone agrees that it's a black and white line. Right? So if one kosher authority says the food is kosher, another kosher authority says the food is not kosher, they're not saying it's more or less kosher. Okay. So, I'm going to ask you a question. Is it okay to transgress a halacha? And by halacha, what I mean is, a halacha is the rules set out for how we are meant to go about doing the mitzvah. So if God tells us to do X, the halacha tells us how we're supposed to do X. If God tells us not to do X, halacha tells us, is it okay to transgress the halacha, the rules?
Okay.
Is it acceptable? Is it morally a good thing that God's like, yeah, that's fine, you're allowed to do that?
No. Why would you say
That's right. Good. So we're going to put this, and we're going to make a very simple thing. Right? Transgressing halacha is forbidden. Okay. Now, what if I know that if I do something, which is not a transgression of halacha, I will most likely end up transgressing halacha? I know that about myself. Is it okay for me to do that thing? No, it's not okay for me to do that thing. Is it itself a transgression of the halacha?
No.
So let's say I know that if I drive past my favorite non-kosher restaurant, I'm very weak-willed, and I'm very likely to stop and get it myself a double cheeseburger. Is it okay now for me to drive past that restaurant?
No.
Okay. But is it correct to say that it is a violation of halacha for me to drive past the restaurant? That would also be incorrect, right? Okay. So now let's ask ourselves, what does it mean when we say that something is permissible? We say that something is permissible, right? It means that you should be allowed to do it. But now we have kind of two degrees of allowance. There's allowance within what the halacha requires, and then there is what is allowed within sound judgment of the importance of keeping halacha. So I can think of many things which are halachically permissible, but are not completely permissible, because they end up causing a person to violate halacha, sometimes more directly, sometimes less directly. For instance, it could be the case that if I do certain activities, which if another person did them, there's nothing wrong with it, but when I do them, it kind of weakens my sense of fear of God. And as a result of that, I end up not conforming to what halacha requires of me. So it's not okay for me to do those activities, not because itself these are violations of halacha, right? But it would be disingenuous for me to say, well, there's nowhere in the Kodesh laws that say it's forbidden, so it's okay. It's like, no, it's not okay. It's not okay. And so I can't walk around saying, if I were to ask God, forget the rabbi, if I were to ask God, are you okay with me doing this? God being all-knowing and knowing exactly how this affects me, he'd say, no, I'm not okay with you doing it. Say, well, God, why didn't you put it in the code of Jewish law? And you say, well, two things. Number one, that isn't itself the mitzvah. That's not how I want you to do the mitzvah, number one. And number two, it is not a substantive of problem for society writ large that the rabbis are warranted in making a law about it directly. But you have a personal responsibility to be mindful of your own behavior and how it affects you.
Yes.
Does this make sense? Right? Which is why the idea that it's technically permitted according to halacha is a really bad justification for doing anything in life.
Can those things change?
What
Based
about?
on
Yeah,
what
for
the
sure.
person is
A person, maybe I get to a point where the restaurant doesn't really have that effect on me, and so what's the problem driving past it? Maybe a person matures and things are different, right?
How do you get to be like the arbiter of that decision?
Well, I don't think it's a good question. I'm going to be very honest. An arbiter is someone who is imposing a judgment upon a situation. And this is much more like a science. The facts are what they are. The question is, are you aware of them? If I do this thing, it's going to have a negative effect on me. Okay, am I aware of that or am I not aware of that? Right. And so here's the thing. It's not a question of authority. In other words, we have to make brachas before we eat, right? That's rabbinic legislation. Okay, so somebody had to legislate that, and someone has to have the authority of what those rules are going to be. And when there's a question about how those rules are meant to be applied, right? Someone has to, that's a question of authority. It's not a question of authority. There's just the facts of the matter. Now, so if it's the facts of the matter, what that requires of me is, number one, a willingness to be honest with myself. Mm-hmm. Number two, a ability to recognize that we always have a certain degree of bias and have mentors and peers. Mm-hmm. And there's no way out of that problem. And the third is a humility, realizing that I'm never going to get it exactly right. Mm-hmm. Right? And the fourth is to not, not let perfection be the enemy of the good, right? Because I'm not going to get it exactly right. Doesn't mean I should go to one extreme. That extreme, I need to, use some degree of sound judgment together with mentors, together with peers. Mm-hmm. But it's not a matter of authority or arbitration. It's a matter of, trying to be in tune with reality as much as possible and being honest about that entails. And obviously, the more immature and less experienced life I am, probably the more I should defer to peers and mentors, right? And the more life experience and honesty a person matures, the more they'll know these things for themselves. Fine. But it's not a matter of authority. The question is who's authorized to make the decision. Unlike halacha, which is God told us we have to do something, or God told us we're not allowed to do something. Now we never know how do I go about doing that. What are the parameters? And that isn't a question of authority. And so there is a permitted, a mutar within the realm of halacha. But in the realm of a human being, of a Jew living life, there's another realm. Is it mutar for me?
Mm-hmm. And so you're saying approach it with humility, not like, I'm going to do this today and see what happens.
Right, that's probably not a good answer. I'm going to do something totally crazy that technically is not forbidden and see what happens. Like, that's probably not a generally good way to live life. Okay. So, here's the thing. The Alter Rebbe is not talking about not doing something that is halachically forbidden. Because if it's halachically forbidden and you're tempted to do it and you overcome the temptation, obviously you have overcome something negative within yourself. Does that make sense? Like God says, live this way. I feel like not living this way. Right? So taking the principle we learned within the forbidden thought realm, right? Which again, we're not at fault for the thoughts entering our mind. And we're talking about how we should view the fact that we pushed them out. But that same thing is true. Let's say I want to eat the cheeseburger and I don't eat the cheeseburger. Well, I've overcome the evil of myself. Right? Fine. Even if the thing is not forbidden in halachic terms, but I know for myself, this is not good for me in terms of my relationship with God, in terms of my devotion to following the way He wants me to live through the Torah mitzvahs. And therefore, for me, it is not mutter. For me, it is not permissible. Right? And I'm tempted to do it and I overcome that. That obviously is overcoming something evil within myself. Right? There's some, I'll use the terminology, yetzer hara, an evil inclination, some stirring within myself, pushing me in what's clearly a negative direction. What the Alter Rebbe is addressing is something which is fully permissible. Fully permissible means that there's nothing wrong with it. Zero, nothing wrong with it. It's not halachically forbidden. It's not even bad for me. There's nothing, it's not going to have any bad effect on me spiritually whatsoever. So what would be an example of something which is completely, fully permissible in this sense?
Can I just clarify something about
Yeah.
the other point? Is like, for instance, like doing something that's like not in the spirit of Shabbos, but it's not breaking
Spirit of Shabbos may actually violate Shabbos. I don't want to talk about Shabbos. Shabbos is a very messy mitzvah because some mitzvahs have a notion of not just regulating behavior, but also regulating the feel of things. So you have, like, for instance, modesty has this, Shabbos has this. Like, kosher food is very simple. Like, there's rules of kosher, if it is or it isn't. We can dispute what those rules are. Shabbos has an element of the feel of the day that's part of the halacha.
like turning on the TV before Shabbos. That wouldn't be like an example.
That probably, you could argue that's actually halachically prohibited because of the unique quality. In other words, like this, something that looks like bacon and tastes like bacon but isn't bacon, and it's clearly labeled as not bacon, and you have the container on the table when you're eating it and it was bacon, there's nothing wrong with eating it because God has no problem with you experiencing what bacon is like. He has a problem with you actually eating bacon. With Shabbos, He actually has a problem with you not being in the Shabbos state. He's quite clear. Mayanot, you should be in the state of rest. Same thing with modesty, same thing with a few other things, right? So those types of mitzvahs, it's a little trickier, and that's why I don't want to talk about it. But if you're dealing with kosher food, it's like the halachas are very clear. Okay. So we'll give you an example of something which is mutter l'gabri, completely permissible. Now, again, it could vary from person to person. We'll take something that for most people would be perfectly permissible.
Eating kosher chocolate cake.
No. Kosher chocolate cake, no. Kosher chocolate cake, maybe not. I want to go something more basic. Completely versatile. You can't think of. You have to think of something that's. There's
Water.
Nothing. What capacity wrong with it?
Breathing.
What?
Breathing.
I don't. You went too far the other way because I want to think of distinct activities.
Water.
Drinking water. Assuming you made a bracha, what's wrong with drinking water? It's not Yom Kippur, right? It's not before Kiddush. What's wrong with drinking water? Like, what's wrong with drinking water? Like, there's nothing wrong with drinking water, right? Can you imagine, like, how, unless a person like has serious psychiatric or psychological problems, how could drinking water possibly, like, lower your fear of God, tempt you into sin? Like, there's no, like, water, drinking water, right? I would go so far as even to saying, like, even eating a sandwich for lunch, right? It doesn't have to be water, right? Yeah? Make sense? Okay. So now, that's the kind of stuff we're talking about. Because the rule is like this. If something is halachically forbidden, it's obviously intrinsically valuable for you to overcome the evil within yourself that's tempting you to do it. Right? If something is halachically permissible, but it is not permissible for you because in an honest self-assessment, right, or taking counsel from peers and mentors, this is not good for you, even though it's technically permitted. Obviously, there's intrinsic value in overcoming yourself and not doing it, right? But what's the value in not drinking water? What's the value in not eating a tuna fish sandwich for lunch if it's kosher and washed into the bracha? Like, what's the big deal? Now, before we go forward, I want to mention something else. There is something called asceticism. What is asceticism? So asceticism is more than just giving up things. It's a way of living where you try to detach yourself from things. There's a Hebrew word that we use for this. It's called precious, separateness. Now, this cannot be understood in different ways. So, for instance, in the Talmudic and in the rabbinic times of the Mishnah, there were different groups of Jews. Familiar with this? Mm-hmm. They're the ones who denied the oral Torah. They were called the Sadducees. Because they denied the oral Torah, they were sad, you see. But then there were also people called the Pharisees. Pharisees is an English translation of a Greek word, which is a transliteration of the word prushim, which means separate ones. Now, but they were not ascetics. The prushim were not ascetics. And then it meant separate is that they were careful with the ritual laws of tum and tar, of purity and impurity, and therefore, because the common Jews generally were not, they couldn't intermingle on the level of eating and things like that. But then there were people who were like actual ascetics, and the term parush or prushim, as Jewish history developed, actually tend to refer to this. And this was somebody who would, as much as possible, abstain from the things of the world. They would drink as little as possible and eat as little as possible and fast and try to not be married or minimize their marital life, and sometimes even these crazy things as like sticking cotton in your ears so you can't hear what's going on, or putting blinders on so you only can see the safer in front of you, like really depriving yourself of what it means to have an embodied physical existence as much as possible, right? And that's really what asceticism is really about. And there's this idea that somehow the less you are engaged with the physicality of your existence, somehow the closer you are to God. Okay? So there's a story. There was a Baal Tshuva who was, this was before there was like a lot of Baal Tshuva, and it was like I think it was like the early 50s, mid 50s, and he was learning in the main yeshiva in 770. This was before there was any sort of notion of Baal Tshuva programs. It was like, and he was thinning out, and not any sort of intentional reason, but he was thinning out. And the Rebbe sees him in the hallway one day, and he says to him in English, he says, Chassidus is not asceticism. There's no intrinsic value of depriving yourself of physical things simply because you think that physicality is somehow evil. And that's what's very important. And that's where we're getting into a very nuanced place. Because on the one hand, we're saying, we're not talking about things that there's any halachic prohibition against. And we're not talking about things that for a person, they know for themselves are places of weakness and that cause them to end up stumbling in sin or lose their sensitivity to God. We're talking about things that are, again, the language, mutar lagamri, perfectly, fully permissible things. And the only thing isn't, they're just part of physical life. Drinking water, having a tuna fish sandwich, I don't know, pick whatever you want, right? It's like, well, what's so bad about it? The answer is, well, if you're saying that asceticism is really not what we're after, then seemingly nothing's bad about it, right? And now the Alter Rebbe wants to somehow bring this notion of overcoming evil into the realm of these fully permitted things, and we want to keep that, though, away from asceticism, because that's not what Chassidus is. So let's look at this very carefully. So he says like this: the more of his impulse that a man sacrifices, even for a while, with the intention of subduing the sitra achra in the left part is where the sitra achra, the unholiness, resides. For example, we're going to focus on the example first, we're going to come back to the language. When he wants to eat, but postpones the meal for an hour or less, and during that time he occupies himself in the Torah, as is stated in the Gemara, that the 4th hour is the time when all men eat, but the 6th hour is the time when scholars eat, because they used to starve themselves for 2 hours with this intention, although after the meal they studied all day. So so let's talk about the sages. The sages in Talmud, what would they do? Everyone would eat in the 4th hour of the day. They would eat 2 meals a day in those times. So if you imagine like you have a day that starts at 6 o'clock in the morning, sunrise, and 6 o'clock in the evening is sunset. So when is the 4th hour of the day? 10. So people would get up and recite the Shema, and ideally pray the Shemona Esrei right at 6 in the morning, right? And then do whatever they had to do, and then people would sit down for their first meal of the day around 10 o'clock. What would the scholars do? They would eat at 12. What would they do while they were, what in the meantime? What would they do afterwards? Did they therefore increase the amount of Torah study? So what's the point? Did they eat the same thing? So what's the point? You see, it's like you're not there's very like you're eating the same thing. All you're doing is delaying it and studying Torah in the meantime, but you're not studying more Torah anyway, right? So let's now go back to the beginning. He says, the more of his impulse that a man sacrifices. Let's start with that phrase. What does it mean, the more of the impulse that a man sacrifices? And it doesn't really have to be men. That's what the translator decided to put there. Because the term is Adam, and Adam is actually one of the few words that's really gender neutral. The word Adam refers to like a person as a person, rather than like specifically male or female. But anyway, fine. What does it mean that the person sacrifices their impulse? So here the Hebrew is very interesting. Okay? There's a Hebrew, what is the Hebrew word for sacrifice? Actually, let's start there. What's the Hebrew word for sacrifice? Korban. It doesn't use the word korban. You know why it doesn't use the word korban? Because korban does not mean sacrifice. Okay? The word korban is derived from the word for closeness. So korban is some kind of an act of bringing oneself close. Okay? So the idea is that if you're talking about in the temple, you bring a korban. What are you doing? What are you doing fundamentally? You are bringing yourself closer to God. That's what you're doing. Okay.
So you're also bringing a sacrifice.
What's up? We're going to get to this terminology now. What does the word sacrifice mean in English? You give up one thing for the sake of another thing. Now, is the emphasis on closeness and the emphasis on the sacrifice, are those synonymous things? I want you to think about this for a second, right? Get married. Your husband does something very loving, whatever, right? And you feel close to him and he feels close to you. And then he says, I want you to realize how much I sacrificed for this. Does that make it better or worse?
Worse.
Sacrifice is a totally different emphasis than closeness, right? And it doesn't mean that they don't interplay with each other, right? But the question is fundamentally, right? When you call it a korban, right? What are you emphasizing? That this is something about closeness, about connection, right? About intimacy. That's fundamentally what a korban is about. That's why they're called korbanot, korbanos. Good? In fact, one of the unfortunate things that has happened in modern Hebrew is when you say that someone is a korban, what you literally mean is a victim. And that's what happens when you take a word, translate it, use another word, then go back to the language, right? Korban means sacrifice. Sacrifice means something is being left out, something suffering, victim, right? And then, so a victim of abuse is called a korban sometimes. Someone who's been a victim of terrorism. It shows the departure from the modern usage, from the original usage. Okay. Now, there's another word, which does not appear here. I'm going to use a different word, okay? There's a Hebrew word called shchita. What does shchita mean? Slaughter. Now, here again, we have to be careful. Okay. When is the word shchita an appropriate word to use? In Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew, in rabbinic Hebrew, what context is appropriate? Every place I use the English word slaughter contextually would fit. When is it used?
Referring to an animal.
Was sacrifices or
Even eating.
food.
Right. So it's used in the context of where you're killing. Generally, it's used in the context of killing the animal for the purposes of food, right? For the purposes of a korban, right? Sacrifice, which is not really sacrifice, right? So what you're doing is there's this idea of ending the animal's life on the one hand, right? But something greater is being accomplished on the other hand, right? So wanton acts of destruction don't really fit the connotation of the word shchita. Whereas in English, we tend to emphasize the violence and the blood in this connotation we use the word, right? So, okay. Make sense? Okay. There is a synonym for shchita called zvicha. Lizboach and lishchot is the same, basically. There may be a slight nuance in meaning, I don't know, but they're effectively synonyms, unless you believe that in Hebrew there are no true synonyms, but they're effectively synonyms. One of the names of the sacrifices that you'll find frequently throughout the Tanakh is a zevach. In fact, the place where the zevach is brought to God is called a mizbeach. But the word zevach does connote killing something in order to achieve something greater, right? Food for a human or closeness with God, right? And so is it wrong to think of the word zevach as connoting sacrifice in the English sense of the word? No, it's not totally wrong. It does have that connotation. You're killing something to achieve something greater, right? That really does, right? So now the Hebrew is, he says, zoveach yitzro. The person slaughters, because that's what the word slaughter means, but it also has the condition of sacrifices their inclination. Right? So just like the animal is killed to achieve some kind of thing, something greater, in the case of a korban, that's closeness with God, in the case of mundane things, it's food, right? So what are we talking about here is that there's this idea of sacrificing one's impulse, one's inclination. How is that different from asceticism? Let's just start there. How's that different from asceticism? What if I don't have an impulse?
What if you don't have
What if I don't have an impulse? Do I gain anything simply by abstaining from something that's perfectly permitted? If the point is to sacrifice the impulse, right? Lizvoach yitzro. If there's no yitzer, if there's no impulse involved, is that even gained if I simply abstain? Okay. Yeah. So let's go back to the description of the sages for a moment. Yeah. What did it say that the sages would do?
It said starve.
Yes, they would make. Yeah, the word in Hebrew is ma'arivim atzmam. They would make themselves hungry. The only value this had is that they actually had a desire to eat.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't the abstaining of food that's at issue. It's
It created the impulse.
It's I have the desire and I am sacrificing it. And what apparently impulses, how do you sacrifice impulses? By not doing them. Okay, which needs to be explored. But I want you to realize immediately the subjective quality of everything we're discussing, right? If it's not a big deal for me to abstain from breakfast, I'm not accomplishing anything by abstaining from breakfast, right? And, if I really need to eat, because otherwise I'm not going to be functional, right? and I don't and I abstain, and therefore as a result of that, like I'm less functional. Like I haven't achieved some amazing things. I abstain for breakfast, right? It is not. There's nothing in the object, right? When God says this is forbidden, this activity is not allowed, there's objectively evil. When I know for myself that if I do this, it leads me down, it is objectively evil. It is not universally evil; it's evil localized, right? But what makes it is it actually has this effect on me. But this is about purely about the way you experience it. Okay? And so what we need to understand is, what is this idea of sacrificing your inclination? Okay, so let's go back a little bit. So it says, even for a short while, notice that, what is it? It doesn't say short in the English, but what?
Hour or less.
You have hour or less in your translation.
Yeah.
When he wants to eat but postpones his meal for an hour or less. Is that what it doesn't say?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes. At the bottom of the first column.
That's for example.
Yeah, oh, that's the example, right. But before that, it just says for a while.
For a while.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so the original Hebrew is shakala, which means a brief period of time. The translation is for a while. So does the quantity matter?
No.
No, it's things right? It's something that's subjective about my impulses. It has nothing to do with the fact that this thing is objectively bad at all. And the quantity doesn't matter, right? But what does matter, with the intention of subduing the sitra achra, with the intention of subduing the evil within the person. So what is going on here?
Sounds like a lot of game.
It is a game. It is a game. It is a game. That's exactly what it is. And if you cannot be playful about it on a deep level, you can't do it. Which is why in chapter 29, the Alter Rebbe says someone whose heart is dull and closed off to God will find themselves pretty much incapable of doing this. One needs to have a kind of open and loving relationship with God in order to actually do this. Because there isn't objectively anything wrong what's wrong with eating lunch? And the answer is nothing is wrong with eating lunch. So if I'm stuck within what do I have to do, what's right, what's wrong, what are my obligations, how do I make sure I don't start down the slippery slope, like if that's where I'm holding, whether it's from the halachic perspective or being more honest with myself individually, I'm never going to get into this place. Okay? In fact, when the Jewish people would bring sacrifices out of a sense of we're obligated to bring sacrifices because that's what God said. What was God's response to that? Are you happy with that? No, right? Okay, same thing. Okay, so now I want to show you. I want to use an example. Okay. This is a very, very difficult example. It's a painful example if you're a modern parent. How do children know that they are valued by their parents? It's a serious question.
Valued?
Valued. The children, they give them attention. So I'm going to argue that that's not true.
When you give them, would you trust them?
What?
When you trust them to go into the world?
Well, that's much older, and I would also argue that's not 100% true because competence and valued are not the same thing. And sometimes those actually are in tension with each other. Sometimes children are very competent, and the parents rely on them. They feel like the parents don't see them as valuable people. They just see them as dependable, reliable, useful, right? But not the same thing.
They're prioritized.
They're prioritized, and this is very, very difficult because when the 2-year-old says "mommy, mommy, mommy," right, or "tati, tati, tati," right? And you're 1 second. What did the child just learn? They learned where they are in your set of values, right? But on the other hand, they say, "My mom said yes." They learn something entirely different. Now, the problem is we live in a world where things move fast and we're interconnected, and it's very, very difficult, right? I'm just as good as any other parent, but there is something very, very profound. It's not that they want to see how hard it is for you to prioritize them. They just need to see that they're being prioritized. And being prioritized does mean at the expense of something else, by definition. If I have nothing else that interests me at all, and I'm spending time with my child, they're not feeling prioritized. They have to actually get a sense that something was set aside for them. And that sends a message. It's a very deep message, and it's a subtle message, and you have to send it repeatedly. And if you announce it very loudly, it doesn't work. Right? If every 3 months you say, I'm going to drop everything for my children and spend some time with them, right? They just learn that you're unpredictable. That's all they learn. But if consistently, right, there's a sense of them being prioritized over other things, balanced with the fact you have other obligations, they get a sense that right, they have a sense of that they're valid. They also have a sense that there's a notion of urgency and sometimes things need to be taken care of, right? And you can't just say it and you have to act it. Does this make sense? Okay. Now, let's turn the reverse. How does the child learn that they're not valuable? That's right. But if you, right, and how do you not prioritize them? The longer they scream, mommy, mommy, tati, 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 and the better you are at tuning them out to finish what you're doing, the more deeply they get the message. They're not valuable. It's not, they don't have that centrality. Yes? Who would you like to show that you really value? Who would you like to make clear to them that they're not really that important? What about your animalistic urges? And if I actually want to do that, and this is what I think, there's nothing objective about not eating lunch or delaying lunch, right? But if I really want to show God how much I prioritize Him, and I really want to show my animalistic drives that they're there and I'll deal with you, but you're not like the priority of my life. How do I convey those messages deeply? Okay, so when I feel the impulse to do something which has nothing to do with God, even though there's nothing forbidden or wrong or evil or detrimental about it, just not to do with God directly, and I say, shh, not now, I'm busy. What message am I conveying to God? What message am I conveying my animalistic drives? That's the sacrifice. And it's a very simple point, okay? And the connection to sacrifice is very profound. There's a statement of our sages, Mali Katli Palga Mali Katli Kula, which means what difference does it make if you kill half of it or you kill the whole thing? In other words, the idea being, is there such a thing as killing something halfway?
No.
So once the message has been conveyed, the message has been conveyed. Does it matter how long the duration is? Is this like a stamina project? How long you can like abstain from like getting into your animals? No, it's not a stamina thing. Was the message conveyed, and whatever that period of time is, that's all it is. It could be a minute, it could be an hour. It doesn't matter what it is. It's not the quantity of the thing. It's that subjective quality. This part of me just isn't that important to me as my relationship to Hashem is. That's it. That's all it is. And that itself is also a form of overcoming the other side. Having nothing to do with, is it forbidden? Nothing to do, is it detrimental to me? And again, if I am not in a positive, almost playful relationship with God, where the notion of growing and exploring and being closer, if that's not part of it, then it's not going to work. Because like, if everything is built around expectations and what is demanded of me and being safe and being secure, like, that's just not going to happen.
Can you explain more this notion of this like abusive and playful relationship?
So, the opposite of play is fear.
And the opposite of play is serious.
No, fear.
I'm saying.
I'll explain to you what I mean, okay? Let's do some obvious examples. Children are playing on the jungle gym, and they're climbing up. The jungle gym, you've got the thing to climb up, and then there's the roof, and they climb up onto the roof, and they're hanging there, and the parents like, oh my gosh. I have a rule, I do not want to be outside when my kids are playing on the jungle gym. It's just like not good for my mental health. Why are they climbing up to these like dangerously high places and having a good time? Because they're not afraid of falling. What happens if they're afraid of falling? They could climb up. You could climb up.
It's not fun.
But it's not fun. It's not playful. You can push yourself, you can encourage, you can do it, but it's not playful. Now, I'll move to another context. Learning. Is learning a playful, fun activity? Not talking just like knowledge accumulation, just reading, accumulating information. Well, here's the thing. If you're afraid of getting things wrong,
It's not fun anymore.
it's not fun. You people who are real intellectuals, you know what they're not afraid of?
Being wrong.
That's right. Worst case scenario, I'll devote my life to 20 years to an idea and discover I was wrong. Okay, cool adventure. Play. It's not that. What's the worst that could happen? What's the worst that could happen? It doesn't work out. Okay, so it doesn't work out. Okay. That play requires that. What's the worst thing that can happen? It doesn't work out. Okay. I'm not afraid of that.
But in this case, it's like I could succumb to.
What's that?
Okay.
Wait, I want to get to the second. Okay. I have friends who are in business. I'm not in business. You know I'm not in business?
You're scared of it.
Yeah, like I invest money. It doesn't work out. It's bad. So like it really like that. I guess I can push myself or whatever, but it's not going to be an enjoyable activity. I have friends like it's enjoyable. Like they really like it. Yeah. It's like what? Yeah, I could. Yeah, my business could go under, and then I'll have to deal with that. That's its own thing. Okay.
But this shouldn't be like the set outlook on life, because there's certain things that if it doesn't work out, it's not okay.
I'm not disagreeing with you. The fact that something is that some mode of living is important doesn't necessarily mean that it's the end all and be all. But it does mean, okay, that if you don't have that kind of sense of things, right? If everything has this quality of fear, and fear comes down to things. It comes down to sense of safety and expectations, right? Things like that. If everything is that, then yeah, that's going to create a problem. This is why we have this whole tension between love of Hashem and fear of Hashem. And not fear that he's going to send me to Gehenna because I'm such a horrible person. It could just be fear of, being disconnected, and fear of succumbing to my more base desires, and, wanting to be, whatever. It has, it could be fear of disappointing him. Right? There's a lot of, right, and that's a fair question. How do those things play off of each other? I'm not saying, in fact, sometimes the opposite is true, right? The two players playfulness, you can cross lines you shouldn't have crossed, right? Kids can do things that are very dangerous and need to be stopped. I'm not disagreeing. But if there is nothing wrong with eating tuna fish sandwich at 10 o'clock in the morning for breakfast, and your whole mindset is, I have to do the right thing. I have to make sure that I am safe and secure in my standing vis-a-vis God Almighty, right? So one of two things. Either I will not be able to find within myself to delay eating the tuna fish sandwich because there's nothing wrong with it, or I will have to come to some warped understanding of how tuna fish sandwiches are really demonic hellspawns trying to drag me away from God, and heaven help you if that's how you live your life. But either way, it's not going to be... What he's describing here requires me to say, yeah, I could eat the sandwich, but... it would be a fun little thing to do. To put the sandwich aside for 5 minutes.
Is it like the concept of delayed gratification?
So it is not like the concept of delayed gratification. I'll explain to you why. Delayed gratification is a functional ability within a person's relationship with himself and their ability to navigate the world. It plays out in relationships. This is only valuable in the context of a relationship. So there's an overlap, but it's not the same thing. If I cannot delay gratification, what ends up happening is because I become a slave to my desires and I become dysfunctional. Or, to put it more accurately, I stay a slave to my desires and stay dysfunctional, because we kind of start out dysfunctional, right? Okay. But the meaning, therefore, in delayed gratification... What? Have you seen an infant? Take an infant. Say, now, the world, navigate it. Succeed in life. The only thing an infant can do is let other people know that it's in discomfort. Very with levels of intensity, without any sense of direction. Right? And that's it. Even facial recognition takes a few weeks. Right? Okay, it's not very functional, right? There's nothing bad about it because
So
it's
it
just how.
sounds negative, but I agree.
Right. It's an important thing, right? The arc of human life is that we gain in functionality in all sorts of areas, and that's what, and then we become fully functional, and then because we're made of flesh and bone and blood, it starts to break down and become less functional. That's kind of the arc of human existence. You could like, that's the way it works. Okay, so getting back to if I am, the delayed gratification is a necessary thing for human functionality. It doesn't, if you make money and then you go spend it on the first thing that you see, right, you're not going to be able to pay your rent and you're going to be out on the street, and that's not good, right? That doesn't have anything to do with a relationship, right? But the notion of conveying to others in your life where they stand vis-a-vis you and how much you value them, that's entirely in the context of relationship, right? And so the more that relationship has a playful and loving and exploratory aspect to it, the more there is room to engage in that, in things that have no, for lack of words, practical value to them. Yeah? To give you an example, I'm not saying you should do this all the time, but you know what you should do from time to time as a parent? You should, you can vary the specifics. You should pick your kid up from school at 10 o'clock in the morning and take them out for ice cream just because. Not every week. Maybe not every month.
And not after like a special.
And not after a special thing. Just because. Just because. Now, you see, like, there needs to be a loving playfulness aspect of your relationship to do that. Like, if you do that because it's on my checklist of things to do, it's like, it's not going to work. Right? You can use that as a technique to remind you to bring yourself that state, but you have to actually have that quality to it. Right? And what you're telling the child is, not that school isn't important, but that school is not, like, your value in life is not that you are doing well in school. That's not what it is about. Like, I just actually like you. Good? Okay. So, and here's the thing. This always involves a shifting around the hierarchy, right? That's what it's doing. So what's happening when the sages of Talmudic times would delay breakfast for 2 hours? What were they shifting around within themselves and the relationship with God? A sense of the hierarchy between how much they wanted to be connected to God and how much they wanted the animalistic desires to have a central role in their life. It had what to do with eating at lunch exactly? Or breakfast? Nothing. That just happens to be the convenience of the opportunity. And if that's not what's happening, then just eat lunch normally. Like, what's the big deal? It's kosher, it's fine. Now, when you get into something which is an indulgent behavior, this is why we're hesitant with chocolate cake, right? Chocolate cake, it may actually be indulgent. In other words, you may be doing something that you really shouldn't be doing. You're like, you are strengthening a kind of a bad tendency and habit within yourself. And if you're honest, you know it, and then maybe you shouldn't be doing that. And that's, each person would have to, what's the situation there. On the other hand, if your mother made you chocolate cake and you don't eat it, that's just because you're being holier than thou. It's not because you're being indulgent, right? Context depends. Yeah.
Do you have to be on like a high level to achieve this? Or
No. You need to achieve it on your level. And one of the things that you can tell if you're doing this for real is that because it's entirely subjective, it doesn't transfer over
to others.
Yeah. The fact that you abstain for breakfast for an hour, whatever it is, because you're playing this game with yourself and God and your animal soul, in no way means that you don't give everybody around you generous portions of food because you're not an ascetic. You don't think that it's bad to eat food.
Yeah.
There was a famous chassid named Rabbi Yitzchak Horowitz, but he was known as Rabbi Itcha the Masna. Itcha is a diminutive form of the name Yitzchak, and Masna means the diligent. He would study, and this is not an exaggeration, he would study Torah for, generally speaking, something like 16 to 18 hours a day. And he was just in a totally different place. And he was extremely, extremely religiously stringent and scrupulous. He would not eat any meat if he did not personally check the knife that was used to slaughter the animal before and after. A lot of what he would. There's a rule that you're not supposed to eat bread that is not baked by a Gentile. There's different levels of this world, and we'll get to it. And he was stringent that even in extenuating circumstances, he would only eat bread that's baked by a Jew, even if it's fully kosher, even if it was kosher baked bread. And at one point there was no bread, and he was very, very stringent. And so the other Chassidim, they lied to him and told him that the bread was actually called pastis, so it was baked by a Jew when it wasn't. And so of course, he suspected they were lying, so he went to go eat it. And he was very meticulous about washing his hands. And it wasn't unusual for it to take him like 10, 15 minutes. If you learn all the laws of washing hands, it's actually not that crazy. Most of us don't. But he was like very, very meticulous. And for this time, it just kept not working. The water would go not on the right part of the hand, or they would touch the cup, and then it would invalidate the hand washing again, what all sorts of things. And after about like 20 minutes, he just decided, it's probably not worth it. He didn't need it. So God arranged that he didn't violate his own standards. Anyway, why am I telling you all this? At one point, he had an orphan. This is in time, I think it was the time of destruction. At one point, he had an orphan. He was in his home that he was taking care of. So now, what would you imagine such a person's attitude is towards food?
Doesn't eat a lot.
He doesn't eat a lot, right? You don't eat a lot, and you expect other people to eat a lot, right? We tend to project. Right? So he went out of his way to find out what this child liked, and this child liked chalva, of all things. And he made sure that before he went off to mikveh in the morning to learn Chassidus and daven and do whatever he does for the next 18 hours, that there would be a little piece of chalva. So then this orphan got up. Here's something to look forward to eat. Because it's not about being an ascetic. It's not about being anti-food or anti-this or anti-that. It's about where, if in myself, are my priorities. And that's why, as the fourth Alter Rebbe said, it is entirely in accordance with the character of who the person is. There is no objective standards to this at all.
Mm-hmm.
And if you start mimicking, right, it's not going to work. And it doesn't necessarily, the easiest example to talk about is food, because the animals that drives for food, but it doesn't have to be food. Let's skip back to where we were. They would delay for 2 hours. They said, so too if he restrains his mouth from uttering words that his heart longs to express concerning mundane matters. Okay, so have you ever read something and that's interesting and wanted to share it? Not because anybody really needs to know it, just because you wanted to share it. And wait a minute. The only reason to share it is because I have this animalistic urge just to share it. And it's the animalistic urge the most important part of me. Do I want it to feel like it's the most important part of me?
Why is sharing an animalistic urge?
Well, first up, because animals share. All mammals share. Yeah,
So does not sharing.
that's true. I didn't say the act of sharing is animalistic. People have an animalistic urge to share, which is why when you read something funny, you look up and you look around, who could I tell this to? There's no need for anybody to know it, right? It's not like there's somebody actually needs to know it, but because I didn't say it's evil to share it. I just said it's animalistic. And the proof that it's animalistic is you may go over to somebody and interrupt them without taking any consideration of whether this is actually making their day better, to tell them this funny thing. And it was very funny, but now they've lost their focus on what they were doing. It's animalistic. Animalistic, it's a drive. It's nothing to do with God. It's nothing to do with purpose. It's nothing to do with meaning. It's not right. Okay. Again. So you say, no. Is this animalistic drive the most important part of my life? Do I want it to feel like it's the most important part of my life? Or do I want God to feel like he's the most important part of my life? So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to not say it for 26 seconds. Why 26? Because it's a funny number. It all has to be the exact numerical value of God's name. And I'll say it. And at that point, what was accomplished? What was accomplished is this. Does anyone else have to know that I did it?
No.
I feel no one else should know that.
There is a truth to that, yeah. It's my God and my animal soul's little secret. Except my animal soul is realizing that he's not welcome as much as he would like.
If you share it with someone else, then they're going to think that that's what they need to do to have a relationship with Hashem.
Right, so there is the issue of educating people about this idea. So, because you can't, people do learn from other people. But you're right, there's this question of what is education and what is just creating artificial standards that have nothing to do with what this is really about. It's true. Okay, and you know what? It gets even better. Likewise, in the thoughts of his mind. I have to figure something. I don't know. I have something that I really want. I really want to feel like the urge to think about. What's something really interesting? It's perfectly permitted. What would be something that's really planning my summer, right? So I feel this. Yeah. Here's what I could review a mission in my head for 10 seconds and then plan. You see why you can't do this if like you're not having like a positive, open, playful. It doesn't work. It just doesn't work. It's like, well, why can't I plan this on vacation? Like you can't. What's wrong? Like it's nothing bad about planning things, right? Like, either again, you have this warped sense, and you become like everything in human existence is evil, which is like in the sense of like literally needs to be avoided as if it's a sin, which is that will really mess up your life and not how God wants us to live. Yeah. And this is even in the least way, it really quantity doesn't matter. That's what this is. Okay? And I want to emphasize, this is not about the thing that all of us need to learn, which is self-control and delayed gratification, because a normal like that's something, a functional thing. We need to learn how to do that. And that is something, if you're not good at it, you need to figure out how to work on that. I don't know. Do some research, read a self-help book, get a life coach, see a psychologist. I don't know. It's not a religious question per se. It'll affect your ability to do stuff, but yeah.
Well, like back to my question about like if this is something that anyone can achieve, like if you have to be at a high level to achieve it, like I mean, you do have to be at a high level of like Hashem.
You have to. I don't say high level. You have to have. There has to be something there that you're working with, and it's not a high level or low level. It's just there's something there.
Like someone who's, let's say, about shiur, who's just starting out, like keeping things, like they could do this.
For sure, because it's about the subjective quality, right? If you have this enthrallment with God and getting close to God and whatever, and you think this is really cool, like yeah, you could do it, even though you're still struggling with keeping Shabbos because you're not used to it. Yeah. But if you grow up entirely religious and you feel very safe and secure in your level of observance and somewhat proud of yourself because you're not, you're on this level, you're actually going to have a very hard time doing this. Mm-hmm. Unless, of course, you twist it into some sort of like super bonus achievement. And then, we've discussed how the problems that creates. Yeah, it's the thing. It's a different accent, not the same thing. It's like, this goes back to using the food example. It doesn't have to be food, but traditionally food was used as a lot of examples. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But a mentor I have, old Russian Chassidus, he said, so you go in Israeli weddings, they come to the main course and they ask if you want the schnitzel or the chicken. Right? They said, so you want to do this, like what should you do? So he said, so you want the schnitzel, so you say the schnitzel. But then if they bring you the chicken by mistake, you don't ask them to take it back. Mm-hmm. Look at the little thing. You find little places where and that's the thing. If it becomes too big, it becomes a heavy thing. It becomes its weight. That's not this. And that's what he says. You need that openness of spirit to do it. Right?
Does this bring the same pleasure as to Hashem? Well, not bringing triggers the same pleasure as.
Well, that's what we're going to learn about next. That's what the chapter goes on. Right? Is this the same pleasure? Is it a different pleasure? Is it a higher form of pleasure? We're going to discuss it. But it's definitely in the same genre.
It should have had to run a higher level of pleasure because it seems like this is a more also personalized relationship, but also more like just more. Yeah.
I'm not disagreeing with you. We just haven't learned that part yet. I think it's very important because if a person doesn't have this right, you can easily see if you just read this quickly, the impression you get is. The less stuff I do that's mundane, the better, which is not what it says. I was very disturbed once. It was cute. Things can be cute and adorable and disturbing simultaneously. So the term for this is called iskafia. Iskafia means subduing. And so we've learned this idea of iskafia b'devar motar, subduing the evil inclination, subduing the strachar in permitted matters. Okay. So the term of subduing can apply in many, many, many levels, right? Because there's conflict and one thing is overcoming the other. So, some Chabad kindergarten, some family, friends. So the wife tells my wife that the kid came home from kindergarten. Mother asks, what did you learn in kindergarten? So we learned about iskafia. And the mother's like, okay, what does that mean? You know, or what kindergarten? What does it mean to So she says, "Nosh in the trash," which is it's adorable and also very disturbing because that's not like the message you're supposed to give little kids, right?
But they think that when they eat nosh that they're doing
No, but you see why this can be a problem, right? Yeah. And I want to go a step further, right? If you're building up a sense of tension and resentment because of all the slaying and slaughtering and sacrificing of your inclination, is you really doing what's describing here? No, you're not.
I would say that even in older, as you get older and people talk about Escafia, it definitely is not Bartos in this way.
It's true, it is not. I would also like to point out that the Chabad culture came out of Russia. Russia, let's just keep in mind, was ruled by a feudal system. And then there was communism. And the notion of harshness and deprivation very built into the culture. And so the notion that who really needs it's not the same thing as asceticism. There's a kind of a what's the word I'm looking for? A kind of harshness about everybody can get by really on nothing anyway. But even in Russia, there was an expression there's no such thing as a scafia on cabbage, tea, and cigarettes. What does that expression mean? The basic things that people need to get by. You have to need. Okay, I'm not advocating cigarettes, but that's how people thought back then, right? You understand? So there's. When they first built the dorms for the yeshiva in Crown Heights, they built a new dorm building. I kid you not, there was not a pillow in every bed. And the Rebbe went through the dorm rooms and pointed this out, these are American boys who've grown up in a place of plenty. They can't get them a bed without a pillow. You hear stories of the idea of to them, an apple, a fresh apple, was to us having an expensive pastry. It's just it's a totally different thing. And so you end up with these things things get twisted and distorted in cultures. It's true. So you have to go back to the substantive thing. What are we really talking about? Paying attention to the context. Where is it showing up, right? And again, a key element of this, you don't see this here, is later on in chapter 29 where he says a person whose heart is closed off to God, it will be almost impossible for them to do what we've described in this end of chapter 27. Well, that's a big clue, right? Because your heart can be closed off and you can still push yourself. He says there are only two things that person, the heart being closed off only has two real consequences. Opening yourself up in prayer, and this idea of skafi b'dor matar, overcoming your inclination when it comes to the permitted matters. It doesn't say that you can't force yourself to do what's required of you. So I think putting those things in context, and some people temperamentally are just harsher people in their temperament. It has nothing to do with the text. It's just who they are as a person. Okay, fine. So you have to adjust accordingly. Good? All right. So this is now the Rebbe told people that two things. He said, of relevance here, he said, the idea that a person is going to live life and just act on impulse without considering the consequences of their actions, that's ridiculous. But the primary education should not be a scafia, this thing when it comes to food per se in the modern world. We just live in a society of abundance. He didn't say those words, but he said primarily should be focused on our thought and how we use our senses.
Our senses mean 5 senses?
Yes, what we look at and what we listen to. Because we do, the idea of being hungry is so crazy to us. It really is. You missed lunch and it's a fast day. We have to cancel classes from 12 o'clock onwards, right? I mean,
yeah.
I want you to think about it. Historically, people were always hungry, and then they had this concept called what we call hungry, and then they were sometimes really hungry, which means you felt that way and there was no food, and you still had to function. And then there was starving, which means you're not able to function because you haven't had food. And we are I feel the mild discomfort because I haven't eaten the past 6 hours. It's just so. You could read about it, or God forbid, people in still parts of the world. Yeah. So obviously, the notion of how you relate to food and delicacies and things like that is going to be a whole different thing than, when I have a whole fridge full of food. Like, what am I in the mood for? Yeah.
What an example of this? I'm wondering if this is an example or if this is going to halacha of like listening to non-Jewish music that's not having like a sexual connotation. No, like it has words, but it's like not talking about something that's like unholy. Like that's something that's not.
So why are you not listening? So the question is why you're not listening to it.
Right. So like if you would have to have the intention that you're not listening.
Are you not listening to it because
music like comes from.
So that goes back to the thing about when I said mutar and magamri completely permitted. What you're saying is it may be halachically permitted, but I'm afraid that it's going to desensitize my soul and I don't want to listen to it. Okay, that's not this. That's a different thing. That's different. Yeah, that's saying I realize things may have an effect on my sensitivity to God and I don't want to expose myself to those things.
But if someone who like is on someone else who like they only listen to Jewish music, but like they want to choose to only listen to this one singer.
I'll tell you like this. My sense is things like this tends to be, can I be very blunt?
Yeah.
Tends to be what happens when a person is young and single and they have time to indulge in fantasies about religiosity. I think it's very, very simple. Listen to music that has a good effect on you, and don't listen to music that has a bad effect on you, both mental health-wise and religiously, assuming the music is permitted. And just accordingly as life moves on, without like setting yourself to like specific standards. That's my personal opinion. It's like there's like if you know it doesn't bring me to a place I want to be, so don't listen to it. if it does, then do listen to it again, assuming it's lawfully permissible, and allow the fact that how things affect you changes in life. It's all about, right? And I'm also I don't know that music for the most part is a good example of this. Simply because I don't know if it plays in the same place in a person, unless we're talking about like music that's really designed to be like arouse more base passions, which is that's something.
That doesn't.
Yeah, but I'm saying right. But I'm saying in general, like the fact that a person likes music that goes in the same category. I don't know, maybe. I think it's a personal question. It could also be just I don't feel just drawn to listen to a particular piece of music that's very strongly, and maybe other people do. Maybe it is. I don't know. But
I don't know, like for myself, like recently stopped listening to non-Jewish music, and I feel like even though it is something that I would enjoy, like I feel like from my relationship with Hashem,
good.
So like wouldn't that be?
That's a good thing. That's not this idea. Yeah, that's not this idea. It's a good thing. That goes back into what you're saying is it maybe this non-Jewish music is halachically permissible. It's not fully permissible because I can feel how it has a dulling effect on my sensitivity, and I don't like that effect. I don't think that effect is appropriate for me. Okay, but that's not this.
So it's
this is like
talking about in the beginning.
Right. Yeah. And those are the kinds of things a person needs to be honest about with them. I had a student, I think I was a little story, who like if you watch a sports game, just the sports game, which is setting aside the question of neglecting Torah studies, and not talking about commercials or things like that, just the sports game. But he realized that like after the sports game, for the next week or so, his like motivation to really invest himself in learning Talmud and Chassidus and these things just kind of take a spiral down, and then he would eventually just feel so disconnected that he would like kind of get re-inspired. And then you watch a sports game again. Apparently, it's not so permissible for you to watch a sports game. It's not like anything intrinsically wrong. Like some other guy can watch a sports game, but for you, I don't know, it does something. I don't know why. Maybe it will stay that way for you. Maybe it won't. Yitzhak Masmid was one time in the same Yitzhak Masmid said he was one time in a private audience with the fifth Alter Rebbe, and we know about this because the person who was supposed to keep the door open and closed to get the people in and out of private audiences felt that he should keep the door open and listen in because Yitzhak Masmid was such a great chassid that whatever was said to him in private audience is of public relevance, which is not exactly an okay thing to do, but we do all benefit from now knowing what was said. And what happened was that he was staying in someone's house, the Nanas family, and the Mrs. Nanas, this was in the city of Kherson in Soviet Russia, asked what, actually not Soviet Russia, it was pre-revolution or in the middle of the revolution, I don't know exactly what.
Imperial?
It was imperial or during the revolutionary times, because Rebbe Shah passed away when the same year the communists, in 1920, same year the communists took over and stuff. So I don't remember exactly, but okay. But he was in Kherson, and he was staying with, and so the Mrs. Nanas, she asked him what does she have to do in order for him to feel comfortable eating in her home. They were a very big family, whatever. Not big because a lot of people, they didn't have a lot of kids, but they were very like devout, whatever. And he said, well, if you get a new pot and you kosher the pot, and I check the knife, and I watch the shechita, and then I check the knife afterwards, I'll eat. And so she did. She was very, very pleased that he was going to eat in the house. And he would, on Shabbos, would pray all day. I kid you not. And so right before sunset, he came back to their house and made kiddush, and there was some other chassidim there, and we sit down and have a little farbrengen, and she brought out, I forgot what it's called, yapchik. You know what yapchik is? Great. If you don't know what yapchik is, think cholent and kugel turned into one thing.
Vegetable food.
It's like potato pickle with meat.
Yeah. So she made some yapchik, although it was, I don't know if it had beef in it. Maybe it was chicken yapchik. But whatever. She was going to yapchik. And she set it down. This was when she set it down in front of him, he asked her, did you add any schmaltz, any chicken fat from another chicken? And she said, no. And he continued speaking to the chassidim, and they sang the gunim, and he kind of just casually moved it away and didn't eat it. And so the Chabad chief rabbi of Kherson, he asked, are you going to eat this? And he said, no. He said, well, I haven't eaten any hot food today. So, like everyone was very wealthy in those days. So I'll eat it. And he ate it. It wasn't that big. I understand it was like small little whatever. And he ate it. And afterward, into the Masvid felt so guilty that perhaps he was holding himself to a standard that was more to do with his own ego and arrogance than anything to do with being sensitive to God.
Mm-hmm.
And so he came into the Rebbe shop in a private audience, and he sold over the story, and he started crying that perhaps he was acting in a way that was, holier than thou, and it wasn't appropriate for him. And the Chassidus basically was the Rebbe shop consoling him that, no, this is in fact appropriate for you. This is how you should behave. You need to have this super sensitivity, and therefore you need to hold yourself to this very high standard. And him going back and forth, but that it's really, he's just, he's treating himself as if he's better than everyone else, and the Rebbe saying, no, you really do need to hold yourself to this standard. So, yes, there are different people, and with what's appropriate for one is not appropriate for the other, and there are things that have a detrimental effect on one of us, and the rest of us doesn't have any problem, right?
Wait, I don't understand. He wouldn't eat it because there wasn't shmaltz?
Oh, I forgot to tell you this. It turned out that Mrs. Nanas did put extra schmaltz in with that, and she forgot.
But he knew?
Each of the Masvid had what we call Ruach HaKodesh. You know what Ruach HaKodesh means? What does Ruach HaKodesh mean?
Literally spirit.
The spirit of the Holy One, right? What does that mean in practice?
You know things.
It means you're guided to things that you really have no business being guided towards. It means when he felt he shouldn't, something made him feel like he shouldn't eat it. He didn't eat it. He probably had no awareness of why. He just didn't feel right, so he didn't eat it. And then he felt really bad that maybe he was like being, holier than thou or whatever. And he was actually a very interesting person. One time, he was going with someone. He was sent around Russia to teach Chassidus and collect money. We call it sowing spirituality and reaping physicality. And they walked into the shul, and everyone stood up. And Shemash made this motion that they should sit, but they don't need to stand. And the other chassid, who was not of remotely his caliber at all, he turns to him in jest, says, "Who says they were standing up for you? Maybe they're standing up for me." And Shemash's face goes, "Oh, you're right." And like in all seriousness, he starts listing all the ways this other chassid was so much of a greater person than him. How could he possibly have assumed they were standing up for him? He was a very, very special person, very profound person, very intense person. Unfortunately, he was burned alive by the Nazis, which is I'll tell you that story. They were locked in a shul, him and another chassid, I forgot who it was. And no, they were in Poland, I think, with a bunch of other Jews. And the Nazis locked the door. And we know this because some people, when the fire happened and the building burned down, some people were able to escape. But people got, hysterical. And so it was a massive, he got onto the bima and he quieted everyone down and said that they're now going to do a mitzvah that not everyone gets to do, which is dying al Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying God's name. And I'm trying to remember if they said the bracha at that point, if they didn't say the bracha at that point, but he put his arm on the other chassid's shoulder and they started dancing like it's Simchas Torah, and that's what happened.
What does masmid mean?
What?
What does masmid mean?
Masmid means diligent one. He learned for 18 hours a day. That was like his regular schedule. Not he sat in front of the book and chatted with people. He actually learned for 18 hours a day every day. Except on Shabbos when he spent the whole day praying. So. Fine. That was him. But the point is to learn from people, not to emulate them. Right. So, no matter how holy we think we are, we should always, by teaching issues, give treats to other people. And I will see you tomorrow, and we'll learn how meaningful this is to God and what are the consequences of that.
Okay, the guitar.
Maybe the